My name is Lauren Peña, and I am currently serving as the Associate Director of Student Recruitment at the Indiana University Robert H. McKinney School of Law. Before working there, I attended the Indiana University McKinney School of Law, and I focused in higher education. I went into law school thinking I wanted to do corporate law, but then took a higher ed law course with Professor Cynthia Baker, and she made me fall in love with the idea of working in higher education. I kind of always knew that I wanted to do higher education a little bit. I did student government in my undergrad at Indiana Wesleyan University, and so it's kind of always been something that was in my path, but I felt like law was something I'd wanted to do since I was 12 years old, and so I knew that I needed to pursue that and get through that hurdle. And now in my role, I really have the ability to help people who are in underrepresented communities and help bring more diversity into the law field from the position of helping people just start breaking down that barrier of even getting into law school in the first place. So it's been really rewarding and really great. One of the things that I really enjoy about being in this role is just coming from my own family background and my own heritage. I am 50% a blend of both Venezuelan and Mexican from my father's side of the family. So having that background and that heritage and bringing in his story and their history has really kind of shaped my views and my viewpoints on kind of the legal community overall as well. So being a first generation Latinx law graduate is something that my family felt very, very proud in. My grandparents lived in Texas. They met in Texas. Their families both came up, and they kind of grew up side by side together. They got married when they were 15 and 16. My grandpa never actually finished more than 8th grade. My grandma never more than 6th grade. And so my grandpa went to work in the factories after him and my grandma got married. Within the first year of their marriage, they had my father. And so growing up for my grandpa, it was always about just like earning money, taking care of the family. My dad is one of 5 children. And so they would go and they would be migrant farm workers in North Dakota and do a lot of the tomato picking and that sort of thing. And then they would come back in the school years and work down in Texas at, my grandpa worked for the Heinz factory down there. And so over time, actually the Del Monte factory, not Heinz. Over time, they kind of were looking for better jobs and a better way of life, and they ended up relocating up to Illinois in the Quad City area. And so when they got up there, my dad was in 7th grade, and he often tells us the story of how growing up in Texas, he was always around his family and his friends, and he only knew Spanish as his first language until he was 6 or 7. And then at that time, the school forced him to learn English, and he had to learn how to speak English and get assimilated into the classroom. And so when he moved up to Illinois and was in a different environment, it was more English speaking predominantly. And during that time, it was customary for them to assimilate a little bit more. That was kind of the goal of, you want to be true American, and to do that, you needed to fit in with the culture and society. So over time, as my grandpa started working for John Deere, my dad really pushed himself in education and was the first in his family to go to college. He figured out a way to self-finance and to get pushed through that, and then ended up going on to Bible college and becoming an ordained minister later on in life. And so he did all of that before meeting my mom. And so it was really interesting because my aunts didn't have quinceañeras. They didn't participate in any of the traditional Latina upbringings that you would find. They weren't really involved in that community because my grandparents felt like they needed to fully assimilate to be in with that culture and community. And one thing that I think was very difficult is hearing my dad kind of go through and learn how to do education on his own. It really pushed him to push us as his daughters to make sure that we were pursuing education and making that a priority. And he had made the decision when we were younger. My mom had really encouraged him, teach the girls both English and Spanish. It will be a valuable asset to them. But since he was taught to not speak Spanish as it was a negative thing, he never wanted to teach us Spanish. And so we never learned Spanish. He never taught it to us. So we would be bilingual, which was unfortunate for us. And so I would say, one of the most difficult parts about my journey through this whole process is, fortunately, while there aren't a ton of strides that have been made, there have been some strides that have been made, and now it is less desirable to assimilate into culture, and it's more of a prominence to be a part of the culture and community that you belong to and really respect and value your background and your heritage. I think we still see times and situations where discrimination comes into play, and we see oftentimes where people try to hide what they really are and who they really are. And when we are constantly, living in that perspective, we're losing a lot of culture and we're losing a lot of our background, which then in a sense loses a part of who we are as a person. And so it was one of those things going throughout undergrad and going throughout into law school was, I definitely felt at a disadvantage, having the last name Peña so prominently out there, and, having that background and that heritage and not being able to, speak that language primarily and not being able to fully understand that culture and connect with it. It was like this part of me that existed, but also this part of me that I didn't really feel like I could be a part of, because I felt like I needed to be a part of this other community just from the conversations of how I was raised. And so learning how to connect and become a part of that part of myself has been a really interesting aspect of my journey. And I think one of the things that makes being Latina so interesting and being so exciting is that people expect it to be one way. They expect you to all look one way and be one way. And it is such a blend, and it's such a beautiful blend. And there's so many aspects of culture and diversity that are even within that identity itself that make it a really wonderful community to be a part of. And it's interesting because even at the law school where I've been working now for 5 years, there are often times where people forget that is part of my heritage. People forget that, I under ethnicity mark Hispanic. I have Latin American roots. I am from that side of my culture, and it does make up 50% of who I am. And so I think it's really interesting to kind of, break those barriers, break down those notions of what would be a traditional, Latin American individual who would come in and what they would represent and what they would be about, and just kind of, take away some of the baggage that came from the older culture of be like white America, be like traditional America, and really take ownership into who you are and where you're from. So when I was younger, and when people used to ask me what I wanted to do when I grew up, I used to say that I wanted to be a teacher. And then somewhere in 7th grade, we had to sit down and we had to research and write a paper on what we wanted to do. And I was like, a teacher sounds boring. It doesn't sound exciting enough. I don't know what I want to do. And so I just started entering different types of things that you could do. And I found out about being a trial attorney. And so I looked a little bit further into it, and I was like, being a lawyer sounds fun. All you do is just talk all day. It's going to be great. And so I kind of just set myself up to continue high school and then through college, and knew that law school was going to be the end goal. And so one of the things that I did was, I was involved in mock trial in middle school and in high school. I participated in the National Youth Leadership Forum on Law in Washington, D.C., a week-long program. And then when I went on to college, I studied pre-law, poli-sci, and business, and I was like, I'm doing law. This is what I want to do. And so, I really kind of laid it all out for myself, took the LSAT after junior year of college, and just kind of set up the way of what I wanted to do. And so when it came time to decide, where I wanted to go to law school and what I wanted to do, it was really interesting because, I not only I kind of did a social experiment. And I probably shouldn't publicly be disclosing this because other law schools around the country will probably kill me for saying it, but I'll say it anyway. It's the fact that I decided that I was going to apply to schools that I knew I could get into, and then I was going to apply to some reach schools for law school, because I was like, I knew what my numbers were, I knew where I fell in, but I was like, not only am I going to check the Latina box, I'm going to check the disabled box, and we're going to see what happens in that program. And so I applied to 13 different law schools, and I got into all 13 law schools. And it was one of those moments where I knew that I wasn't going to be able to actually do well at a couple of those law schools, and I decided, I obviously wasn't going to go there, but I knew that it was one of those things that I had to sit down and then figure out what I wanted to do. And it was almost to the point where it was a little bit frustrating, because I really wanted to know which law schools I was actually going to be capable at and which law schools I was going to do well at. And I feel like one of the things that I found a problem with was, just because I have this diversity, I shouldn't be able to just get in because I have this diversity. I should be able to get in because I'm actually going to do well. And so, I kind of have used that metric in my job at the law school now of, looking to people and talking to people and helping them make that choice about which law school is really going to be the best fit for them, not based on their diversity, not based on what makes them unique and different, because that will always be important no matter what law school or what community you go into, but more where are they going to succeed and where are they going to shine, because that was a conversation that I didn't get to have when I was deciding what I wanted to do. And then also while I was in law school, I think it was really interesting because, again, as I mentioned earlier, I think it fell back into what camp of people did I want to put myself into. Did I disclose that I was Latina when I was applying to law jobs? Did I disclose that I was disabled when applying to law jobs? It was one of those things where the law is still very much an old white boys club, and it is changing and it is shifting. But it was one of those things where I didn't really know how different I wanted to be, because already being a female was different enough to get into the legal world. So now being a Hispanic disabled female, as I like to say, I was checking 3 boxes that make people very nervous. And so trying to figure out, what my role was going to be in law school was very, very interesting and very, very difficult. I also think, coming from a family background where my dad had been a pastor and then later on worked in banking, and my mom, who didn't go to college but worked in music and worked in the education system, I didn't really have anyone to talk to or to have communication with about what I wanted to do with this law degree. I was going to get this law degree. The end goal was to get the law degree. And then it was almost like upon graduation, I was like, okay, now what am I going to do with this? And so that's why, again, even now, learning from my own situation, learning from what I do, I spend so much time with my students, pushing into them, okay, why do you want to come to law school? What is your motivation? Because I think it's so important to, if you're coming from a community, especially if you're first generation, to be able to know what is your motivation behind it, not just obtaining that education, not just obtaining that degree, but what you want to do with it, because then you're just putting yourself in a position where you're not entirely sure what it's going to pan out to and what it's exactly going to look like. So really, I would say my law school journey kind of just taught me a lot about that, and taught me a lot about who I am and what I wanted to be and what I wanted to represent, and ended up leading me in the perfect path for me. It ended up leading me into higher education, especially in the law world, and helped me to really help out those communities of people that, were like myself and that I could help out, and really help build upon that over time. So as we begin discussing the lower number of individuals from the Latin American community who are in the legal field, and whether or not we should have more, the answer is always going to be yes. I definitely think that, as I previously mentioned, the law field is slowly morphing away from being the white boys club into becoming more a representative society. One thing that I really love about having a law degree is, even though I don't actively practice, I do have an active license. And so what I love about having that is I get to keep up on the law, I get to keep up on what's happening, and I get to help people who don't always understand or comprehend what the law is saying or what it means or where to even begin to start looking through the process. And I get to be a person that gets to explain that to them just by having that knowledge and that information. And I think the more people we have represented in that community who come from different backgrounds, who come from different representations, the stronger and more accessible it becomes to people. It takes it away from being this unattainable, aloof, unmanageable process that we have for society, and it becomes this thing that makes a lot more sense, and it helps the community to develop laws that are relevant for that particular society. I think all of that also just comes with education in general. I think education is the key to moving in all different facets. I think one, from the education system listening to the communities out there who don't feel like education is attainable for them and who don't feel like they can get in, and adapting their education and adapting the way that they run higher education institutions to allow for them to get in and come in and be a part of that community. But then also from the individual themselves of, taking away that stigma behind what will happen if I get educated, what will happen if I do become a part of higher education. I think one of the things that, we often see is people feeling like, they don't really know where they belong in society. And, one random statistic that I heard is that only 2% of all faculty members in the law school world are a Latin American descent. Only 2%, which means becoming a law professor is one of the hardest jobs in the world, but not for people who are Latin American. And so if we had more people who wanted to feel confident in their legal skills and their legal knowledge and really were mentored and brought up and pushed through better, they would probably be able to get a job extremely easily, extremely quickly as a law professor, because that area, that subculture is so needed. It's one of those things that we can't expect students to be sitting in the classroom as one of the largest minority populations and not have faculty members who don't understand where they're coming from and who haven't had some of the similar struggles. And so to have people and to have that representation would be very beneficial to, faculties at large, and I think would change legal education in general. And the same can be said for the disabled community. Of the total attorneys who are disabled, less than 3% are actually practicing, and of that 3%, less than 1% are actually partners in law firms. So it's, again, a whole untapped part of the community where there are millions of people who are disabled, but you're not seeing those attorneys being in there. I think it's the same analogy for the Latina community. And then, I think as far as just looking forward to getting into higher education and getting involved in higher education, I think the first thing that people always need to do is to always speak with somebody about it. Find a trusted advisor, because I think one of the biggest misnomers that happens is people don't ever really talk through all the steps and think through all the steps and figure out what it's going to fully look like. And there are people whose jobs there it is to do that and to sit down with people and help them lay it out and help them plan it so that they are, really getting all the information they need to be the most successful that they can be. And so I would say, looking back at my younger self, and what I would tell my younger self is to really sit down and evaluate, what contributions to society I want to make. How am I going to be a player that's going to help other communities feel like they have a voice and a seat at the table, and what can I do in my education to make that happen? And then what can I do to encourage others within education to make changes and make movements as it goes on? And I think that would be, just beneficial to the whole community overall.